What's going on, guys? Deuce Douglas here, and back with an updated version of my All-Madden simulation sliders and settings that I will be using heading into Season 3 of the Falcons franchise. For those of you that might be new here, these are a set of sliders that I've tuned based on 2 full seasons of my franchise series, as well as countless Play Now and other franchise games that I've played. And if you want a pretty good idea of how these will look in action, you can watch any of my recent Falcons franchise games, as this set is very similar to what was used in those games. But I'm going to start here with some basic game options. As the title states, these are All-Madden simulation sliders, and I choose to play on 15-minute quarters with accelerated clock on and the runoff to 13 seconds. My goal there is to have a realistic number of plays in each game, and with those clock settings, I get anywhere from 120 plays to 140 plays, depending on how the game plays out. The league average for 2019 was 127 plays per game, which is pretty typical to where it usually is, and is in the range that I always try to shoot for when determining clock settings. Below that, we have some franchise options, and it's pretty straightforward here, as well as entirely personal preference. I always prefer full control, but if there's anything that you want to avoid or don't feel like interacting with in your franchise mode, it can be set to auto, and that's perfectly okay. But getting into the sliders here, if you've seen or used the first 2 versions of these sliders, and more so the most recent set, these are nearly identical. I think I only made 2 changes. I definitely considered doing more, but ultimately felt like I was already getting good games as it was, so I didn't want to change too much and risk messing things up. The thing I want to stress here, though, is that while these do work well for me, that doesn't mean that they'll just be plug-and-play awesomeness for you. Skill level, play style, and the teams and players you're using are all going to factor into how games are going to play out. So think of these more as a base to start from rather than anything absolute. But what I'm going to do now is run through each slider and explain why it is the way it is. So starting here with user passing, I have accuracy set to 40, and I considered bumping this up to 45 because this was really tailored to having Matt Ryan at quarterback with his dead-eye abilities, and with someone that doesn't have those abilities, things can get really wild and really random, which is obviously something that can get frustrating. But the more that I've played, the more that I felt okay with it and kind of adapted to it, so I left it there. But if you're using a lower rated quarterback or find yourself getting too annoyed at terrible inaccuracies, do not be afraid to bump this up to 45 or even default. On the CPU side, it's at 20, which I would say is fine. It's not really good, it's not really bad, but it's good enough, I would say. With all the checkdowns and just being on All-Madden in general, the CPU is going to be hyper accurate, and you will see some inaccuracies, but instead of those coming more often from lesser rated quarterbacks, it just feels entirely random, and I'm not really sure that there's much that could be done with this slider to change that. Pass blocking remains at 50, and this is a slider that I just choose not to mess with. I think it's in a pretty good spot where it is, and I get a decent balance of having a lot of time to throw versus not having much time, and it makes you have to be quick with your decisions. X Factors and Superstars will eat you alive at times, but for the most part, I'm okay with that, so it remains at 50. Same thing for the CPU side here. My existential crisis with All-Madden is that I'm always near the top of the league in sacks, but never really get a lot of pressure, and I get a lot of sacks because of the AI holding onto the ball for so long, so it's basically a catch-22 of lowering this slider and getting a ton more sacks because the AI can't handle pressure well either, or leaving it as it is and sacrificing that pressure to keep the sacks at a realistic number, which is what I choose to do. Wide receiver catching is at 45 because I felt like after my first season I had a little too much success with contested catches, so I took it from 50 down to 45, and this past season I didn't really have any issues. It actually introduced some straight up drops, which I never saw at 50, but not to the point where it was consistent or annoying, so I do really like the feel of it at 45, which is why it'll stay there. Once again, the same for the CPU side, and this doesn't really have so much to do with contested catches like it does for the user, and was mainly just to try and create some more incompletions in general. I'm not really sure that that's worked out the way that I would have liked it to, but it's felt okay, and like the user side, it creates some occasional straight up drops as well, which is nice to see. On to the rushing sliders, I decided to leave my run blocking slider at 40, but I will say here that I strongly considered moving it up. The reason why I didn't is because running has felt difficult but earned, if that makes sense, and I feel like when running the ball is too easy, it becomes way too easy to control possessions and control games, so I'd much rather have it be too tough than too easy. But I will say on this setting, you will see a lot of insta-sheds and a lot of tackles for loss, but there is running room to be had, and I really like the more grindy feel of the run game that this has provided. On the CPU side, the slider also remains the same, but at 50, and this is a weird one because in the middle of last season, I believe after one of of the patches, it felt like the CPU couldn't run the ball anymore, and there was a game where I held Ezekiel Elliott to like 19 yards on 19 carries, but towards the end of the season and then in a bunch of my recent test games, I couldn't stop the CPU running game at all, and it almost got to the point where I felt like I might actually need to turn their run block down, so that kind of back and forth ultimately led me to just leaving this at 50. For fumbles, remember here, a higher number means less fumbles, and I left this the same on the user side at 80, and to be honest, this could probably be a lot lower, but my main fear is getting back into a fumble fest due to the hit sticks, so I do prefer to keep this at a higher number than it needs to be just to avoid the frustration that I personally have with that. But if you feel this number is too high, playing with it at a lower number or even a significantly lower number is definitely something you can choose to do. On the CPU side, we have our first change as I took their fumbles from 90 down to 85. I didn't force a single fumble last season, which I honestly don't have too much of an issue with. Like I said, I much prefer a more straight up game than a turnover fest due to a single game mechanic, but having 0 forced over an entire season tells me that I can dial it back a bit without risking things getting out of control. And once again, it's the same thing here as for the user side. If you don't mind seeing more fumbles, by all means, you can lower this slider. This is just my personal preference. Then we have pass defense, which for the user is completely the same with reaction time and pass coverage both at 50. And I always lump these two together because I've never really been sure of what they do or if they do anything at all. There's been theories for years that they're reversed, and I've never really noticed a difference when I do adjust them, so they will both remain at 50. Then interceptions at 25 is to once again keep turnovers down. Keeping this low makes turnovers feel not necessarily more earned, but less taken for granted, if that makes sense. You're going to drop picks, which sucks, but then when you do get the interceptions, it feels a bit more exciting in my opinion, and I feel just creates a better, more well-balanced game. Then on the other side, same thing for the CPU with reaction time and pass coverage both being at 50. I don't really know what they do, and there's already enough psychic activity in the secondary to warrant not raising it, and coverage isn't crazy enough to lower it, so just like for the user, at 50 it remains. Then the other change I made was to lower the CPU interceptions from 40 to 35. I thought about taking this down to as low as 30, but felt like that might be taking things a little too far. Defenders in Madden are going to put themselves in position to get interceptions at an insanely higher rate than what you see in real life, so lowering this slider is to try and kind of take the edge off of that a little bit, but the reality here is still that if you throw a terrible pass, it's more than likely going to be picked off either way, but at 35 or 30, you might get away with a couple here or there, whereas at 40 or 50, you don't really get away with anything that touches a defender's hands. And then lastly here is tackling, which has remained the same on both sides. For the user, I have it at 55, and this is what I like to call the All-Madden tax, because tackling is one of those areas that All-Madden uses to make the game seem tougher, so bumping it up to 55 is an effort to basically try and even the playing field with the CPU that remains at 50. One more thing here though is that I did notice in a lot of my test games and then in preseason of the Falcons franchise as well that it seemed like the CPU broken tackles were way more frequent than I was used to, and to the point that it almost felt like an issue. I don't remember seeing a patch that changed anything, and I haven't had any issues before, but this will be something that I keep an eye on over the next season. And then one last thing I always forget to mention is that I turned punt power down to 40 because it's way too easy to consistently boot 50+ yard punts or even longer with the wind factored in. Unfortunately, you can't do this for the CPU, but it's not as much of an issue for them, so no worries there. Next up here is some penalty sliders, and nothing exciting here as they are all default. I mentioned this each slider video, but I've messed with penalties a bunch before and pretty much gave up, as adjusting them really doesn't change much anyway, and leaving them alone eliminates any possibility of them having adverse effects on gameplay, which has always been a common theory. The only thing I probably would consider here is lowering face masks, because I've noticed that they tend to be the most commonly called penalty, but overall these really just come down to personal preference, and I choose to leave them at default. Then as I begin to wrap up here, I have some more general game options, starting with the coin toss, which is set to receive, because if you choose kickoff, you're going to be kicking off to start every single game because the computer automatically defaults to receive. For the gameplay helpers, these are all personal preference, so whatever you like and enjoy here is absolutely fine. The only thing that I leave on is auto flip defensive play call, but again, this is all personal preference, so if you want to play with any of these on or off, by all means go ahead and do so. I include vibration here as well, which is turned off because when kicking or punting, the vibration tells you when your accuracy line is touching the uprights or the out of bounds. So I turn that off to not have that available and make kicking the teeny tiniest bit tougher. Then at the bottom, we have some general options starting with injuries at 40, and this has felt pretty good to me. I've gone through extended periods of time where nobody has gotten injured and then had that run of games last season where I lost several key starters. So it gives and it takes, but I like the feel of it where it's at. Fatigue and speed threshold are both at 50, and to be honest, I haven't tested or adjusted these at all, so I can't really say whether lowering or raising these might be better or worse, but I haven't had any issues, complaints, or a reason to change either of them, which is why they've always stayed at default. And then lastly, here are T-Dawg's XP sliders that I've used in both Season 1 and Season 2, and I have zero complaints with these. As I did in my first two slider videos, I will link the Operation Sports thread in the description where he goes into more detail about the methodology and reasoning behind why these are the way they are. But I think that covers just about everything. I got a question yesterday about whether or not I was using the NFL Live playbooks from the December patch, and I actually haven't been using them and probably won't be moving forward. I always worry about things like that messing with CPU play calling or just creating weird issues in general. But that's going to do it here. I hope these sliders and settings can help you guys in one way or another. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments because I always forget to cover something with these videos. But I appreciate you guys tuning in. And as always, thanks for watching.